In the shadows of America's most shameful era, some horrors went unwritten. Practices so vile that even those who participated dared not speak of them openly. This is the story of one such dark affair in the Arizona Territory, 1879. They called it a property auction, but what happened that day at the Murphy Ranch crossed lines that shocked even the most calloused souls of the frontier. A woman, identity concealed, sold to the highest bidder, like livestock. What no one expected was the man who stepped forward. A rancher, whose presence alone made some men reach for their guns. A man who wasn't supposed to have power in these parts, let alone use it to challenge an entire town's unspoken codes. What happens when one act of defiance threatens to unravel decades of carefully guarded secrets? And what terrible price awaits those who dare to rewrite the rules of the Wild West? This incredible true story exposes one of the darkest chapters of frontier justice that history books won't tell you about. By the end of this video, you'll understand why some accounts of the Old West were deliberately erased from our collective memory. If this is your first time here, I'm sharing untold stories of black heroes from America's past on the Black Rancher channel. Hit subscribe now and ring that bell so you never miss these powerful tales that deserve to be told. Now, let's dive into Chapter 1 of a story that will change how you see the American frontier forever. Arizona Territory, May 1879. Isaiah Freeman rode into Copperstone as the afternoon sun cast long shadows across the dusty main street. At 42, he cut an imposing figure, tall and broad-shouldered, with a neatly trimmed salt and pepper beard framing a face weathered by years under the southwestern sun. His dark brown Stetson was pulled low, partially obscuring keen eyes that missed nothing. The town had grown since his last visit. New wooden structures had sprung up alongside the original adobe buildings, signs of prosperity from the nearby copper mines. He noted how conversations died as he passed, how men stepped aside but kept wary hands near their holsters. Isaiah was accustomed to the attention. As one of the few black ranchers in the territory, perhaps the only one with significant holdings, his mere existence was an affront to many. But 15 years of backbreaking work had transformed the rocky 100 acres he'd purchased after the war between the states into the Crescent Moon Ranch, now spanning nearly 1,000 acres with the territory's finest horses. He dismounted outside Pearson's general store, tying his stallion, a magnificent black Arabian named Thunder, to the hitching post. "Don't cause no trouble here," muttered a white-haired man sitting on a bench outside the store, tobacco juice staining his beard. Isaiah didn't bother responding. He'd heard worse, much worse, in the 15 years since he'd arrived in the Arizona Territory, with nothing but his war pension and dreams of building something that was truly his. Inside the store, conversation halted. A young woman gathering supplies froze, her eyes widening. The shopkeeper, Walter Pearson, a thin man with spectacles perched on his nose, cleared his throat nervously. "Mr. Freeman," he acknowledged stiffly. "What can I help you with today?" "Need supplies, Walter, same as last month." Isaiah placed a list on the counter. "And information." "Information?" Walter's voice pitched higher. "Heard there's an auction tomorrow at the Murphy place, looking to expand my herd." Walter's eyes darted to the other customers, then back to Isaiah. That's not a cattle auction, Mr. Freeman." "What kind is it then?" A tense silence filled the store. The young woman slipped out the door, leaving her basket behind. "Property auction," Walter finally said, voice low. After Samuel Murphy's passing, his son settling affairs before heading back east. Isaiah nodded slowly. "I have coin to spend. Any reason I shouldn't attend?" No one answered directly, but the chill in the room was answer enough. "I'll have your supplies ready in 20 minutes, Walter said, taking the list and retreating to the back. Outside, Isaiah sensed the change in atmosphere immediately. A group of men had gathered, led by Sheriff Cole Donovan, a barrel-chested man with a handlebar mustache and a perpetual scowl. "Freeman," the sheriff called, hand resting on his holstered Colt. "Heard you're asking about the Murphy auction." Isaiah faced him squarely. "That a crime now, Sheriff?" "No crime. Just friendly advice. That auction ain't for you." "My money spends same as any man's." The sheriff stepped closer. "Listen carefully. You've been tolerated in these parts because you keep to yourself. Start getting ideas above your station. Might be time for you to move on." Thunder snorted and stamped, sensing his master's tension. "I earned my place here same as anyone," Isaiah said evenly. "Fought for this country same as you. Got the scars to prove it." A younger man in the group spat in the dirt. "Fought on the wrong side, I reckon." "Fought for the Union, boy. Same as your sheriff here." Isaiah's eyes never left Donovan's face. "Difference is, I still believe in what we fought for." For a moment, violence hung in the air between them. Then, unexpectedly, a voice called from across the street, "Leave him be, Cole." Judge William Harrington, 70 years old and still straight-backed, crossed the street with the aid of a cane. His reputation for fairness had made him both respected and resented in equal measure. "This isn't your concern, Judge," the sheriff growled. "Public intimidation on the main street of my town is very much my concern." The judge looked at Isaiah. "Mr. Freeman has every right to attend a public auction, unless there's something about this particular auction that makes it unusual." The question hung in the air, loaded with implication. Sheriff Donovan stepped back. "Just making conversation. No law against that." He tipped his hat mockingly to Isaiah. "Enjoy the auction, Freeman. Might be educational." As the group dispersed, Judge Harrington approached Isaiah. "Walk with me to my office, Mr. Freeman. I believe there are some aspects of tomorrow's proceedings you should be aware of." The judge's office was a modest space above the town's only law office, filled with leather-bound books and smelling of pipe tobacco and old paper. Judge Harrington settled behind his desk with a sigh, gesturing for Isaiah to take a seat. "I've watched you build something impressive these past years," the judge began, filling a pipe with practiced movements. "Not many men could have turned that rocky patch into what you have." "Thank you, sir. But I suspect you didn't invite me here for compliments." The judge struck a match, the small flame illuminating deep lines in his face. "No, indeed. I need to speak plainly about tomorrow's auction." He drew on the pipe, releasing a cloud of smoke. "What do you know about Samuel Murphy?" Isaiah considered. "Cattle baron, one of the first settlers in the territory. Died last month after a fall from his horse." "Yes, though there are whispers it wasn't entirely accidental. Murphy had enemies." The judge leaned forward. "But more relevantly, he had peculiar practices, operated outside the law in ways that many in town benefited from, which is why they turned a blind eye." "What kind of practices?" "Smuggling, primarily. Moving contraband across the border. But there were other activities. Women brought north from Mexico under false pretenses. Debt bondage arrangements that skirted dangerously close to slavery, which, need I remind you, is illegal throughout this nation." Isaiah's jaw tightened. "And tomorrow's auction." The judge's expression grew grave. "Murphy's son Ethan is not his father's moral equal, if such a comparison can be made. He's auctioning off all his father's assets before returning to Boston, including what he calls contracted labor. I have reason to believe at least one person will be sold under circumstances that violate both territorial and federal law. And you, as judge, are allowing this?" Judge Harrington's eyes flashed. "I've sent telegrams to federal marshals, but the nearest are 3 days' ride from here. I've considered stopping the auction, but without outside support, I would likely succeed only in getting myself killed and allowing Ethan Murphy to conduct his business with even less scrutiny." He studied Isaiah thoughtfully. "Which brings me to why I wanted to speak with you. Your presence at the auction would be disruptive in ways that might prove useful." Isaiah understood immediately. "You want me there to cause a stir?" "I want witnesses to whatever transpires. Murphy's allies control much of this town, but not all of it. Public sentiment could shift with the right catalyst. With respect, Judge, using me as your catalyst could get me killed." The judge nodded gravely. "Indeed. I wouldn't suggest it if I didn't think the stakes warranted the risk." He hesitated. "There's something else you should know. The woman being auctioned, I have reason to believe she's educated. Eastern. Not someone who belongs in such circumstances." "No one belongs in such circumstances," Isaiah said sharply. "Of course." The judge looked abashed. "Poor choice of words. My point is that her story, should it become known, might draw outside attention in ways that would benefit more than just her. Isaiah stood, his mind working. "I'll consider attending, but not as anyone's pawn, not even yours, Judge." As he reached the door, Judge Harrington called after him. "Mr. Freeman, if you do decide to bid, you should know that Murphy's foreman, Jackson, has been instructed to ensure no undesirable elements succeed. Be prepared for that." Isaiah nodded once, then descended to the street where Thunder waited patiently. The supply wagon from Pearson's was loaded and ready. As he untied his horse, he noticed a small piece of paper tucked into the saddle. Unfolding it revealed a woman's handwriting. "They keep her in the root cellar, sack over head so none can identify. Not Mexican. Says her name is Catherine. Help her if you can." There was no signature. Isaiah tucked the note into his pocket, mind racing with new questions. One thing was certain. He would be attending tomorrow's auction, no matter the risk. The Murphy Ranch sprawled across the valley floor, its main house visible for miles, a two-story structure of lumber and stone that showcased Samuel Murphy's wealth and ambition. By mid-morning, wagons and riders had created a small city of temporary visitors, with the auction set to begin at noon. Isaiah arrived deliberately late, when the crowd had already gathered in the large barn that had been cleared for the occasion. He tied Thunder at the far edge of the property, away from other horses, and approached on foot. His appearance at the barn entrance caused a ripple of murmurs and sideways glances. Ethan Murphy stood on a raised platform, a city man playing the role of frontier businessman in an expensive suit that had never seen trail dust. Beside him stood Jackson, the foreman, a heavily muscled man with a face like carved stone and dead eyes that immediately fixed on Isaiah. "Ladies and gentlemen," Ethan called, his Boston accent pronounced, "we'll begin with farm equipment, then proceed to livestock, and finally to property and contracted labor arrangements." Isaiah found a position against the back wall next to a support beam. From there he could observe the entire proceedings. He noted Sheriff Donovan near the front, along with several prominent ranchers and businessmen from town. Judge Harrington sat in a corner, his expression grim. The auction moved quickly through equipment and supplies. Isaiah made several modest bids on horsetack and tools, winning some to establish himself as a legitimate participant. When the livestock came up, he purchased 2 young mares at fair prices, causing some surprise but no overt objections. By mid-afternoon, the crowd had thinned as most of the desirable items had been sold. Only about 20 people remained when Ethan Murphy cleared his throat and announced, "Now we come to a special opportunity. My father maintained certain labor contracts that I wish to transfer before my departure." A side door opened, and Jackson emerged, roughly guiding a figure with a burlap sack covering their head. Even through the shapeless dress, Isaiah could tell it was a woman, slender, of medium height, her hands bound before her with rope. "This contract has 4 years remaining," Ethan continued smoothly. "The holder assumes all responsibility for housing, feeding, and ensuring the contracted party fulfills their obligations. Starting bid is $100. An uncomfortable silence fell over the barn. Even in Copperstone, this brazen display crossed lines that many found troubling. Isaiah's hand clenched into a fist as he fought to control his anger. $50, called a voice from the front. Silas Turner, owner of the territory's most notorious saloon. $75, countered another man. The bidding continued haltingly, reaching $150 before stalling. Throughout, the woman stood motionless, her face hidden, her dignity stripped away by the sack and bonds. "Going once at $150, Ethan said, sounding disappointed at the low figure. $300. Isaiah's voice cut through the barn like a whip crack. Every head turned. Shock registered on faces throughout the room. Sheriff Donovan's hand moved to his gun belt. Ethan Murphy's surprise gave way to a thin smile. "I believe we have a new bidder. Mr. Freeman. Isaiah Freeman." "Mr. Freeman bids $300. Ethan looked around the room. "Do I hear 325s? Silence. Then Turner called out, "325. Isaiah stepped forward, moving into the center of the room. $500. Gasps rippled through the crowd. It was an enormous sum. Mr. Freeman, Ethan said silkily, while we appreciate your enthusiasm, I'm afraid these particular goods are not available to your kind. Is my money not good enough? Isaiah pulled out a leather pouch heavy with coins. Gold spends the same, regardless of who carries it. Judge Harrington stood. As the presiding legal authority in this territory, I must remind you, Mr. Murphy, that refusing a legitimate bid based solely on the bidder's race would constitute a violation of the Civil Rights Act of 1866. Ethan's smile vanished. He consulted briefly with Jackson, who scowled darkly at Isaiah. Very well, Ethan said tightly. $500 from Mr. Freeman. Going once, going twice. $550, Turner interjected desperately. Isaiah never took his eyes off the woman as he responded. $1,000, cash. Now. The barn erupted in shocked exclamations. It was an unheard-of sum, enough to buy prime grazing land or a substantial herd. Sold, Ethan declared quickly, unable to hide his satisfaction at the unexpectedly high price. Approach and complete your transaction, Mr. Freeman. As Isaiah moved forward, he felt rather than saw several men shifting their positions, hands near weapons. He placed the gold on the table before Ethan, who counted it with obvious pleasure. The contract transfers all rights and responsibilities to you, Ethan said, pushing a document forward. Sign here. Isaiah signed, then turned to the woman. With deliberate movements, he removed a knife from his belt. Several men tensed, but he used it only to cut the ropes binding her wrists. Then, with gentle hands, he removed the sack. Gasps filled the room. The woman blinked in the sudden light, her eyes adjusting to reveal a face of striking beauty. But it was more than that. It was a face some recognized. That's impossible, someone whispered. Her long dark hair was tangled and dirty, her face smudged with grime, but there was no mistaking her identity. Catherine Murphy, Samuel Murphy's daughter-in-law, Ethan's wife, reportedly back east for her health. Her eyes found Isaiah's, filled with a mixture of fear, gratitude, and determination. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice hoarse from disuse. "This is outrageous." Sheriff Donovan stepped forward, hand on his gun. "Ethan, you can't be selling your own wife." Ethan's face had drained of color, though whether from anger or fear wasn't clear. "This woman is no longer my wife. Our marriage was annulled months ago." "Liar," Catherine said, her voice stronger now. "There was no annulment. You drugged me, imprisoned me, and now you attempt to sell me like property to cover your gambling debts before you flee." The barn had become deathly quiet. Isaiah stood protectively close to Catherine, aware that they were surrounded by potential enemies. "These are wild accusations from an unstable woman," Ethan said smoothly. "My poor Catherine suffered a nervous collapse last winter. Her mind is not sound." "My mind is perfectly sound," she replied. "Sound enough to remember where your father kept his ledgers, the ones documenting every illegal transaction, every bribe, including those to our good sheriff." Donovan's face flushed dark red. "That's enough. This auction is over. Mrs. Murphy is coming with me for her own protection." "She's not going anywhere with you," Isaiah said quietly, his stance shifting subtly. "I have a legally binding contract, witnessed by the territorial judge himself. Unless you're planning to violate federal law in front of 20 witnesses." Judge Harrington had moved to stand near Isaiah and Catherine. "Sheriff, consider carefully what happens next. As of this moment, Miss Catherine is under Mr. Freeman's legal protection. Any attempt to interfere could have serious consequences when the federal marshals arrive." "Marshals?" Ethan's voice cracked. "Due tomorrow or the next day," the judge confirmed. "I took the liberty of requesting their presence to review certain irregularities in the territory's governance." For a moment, violence hung in the balance. Isaiah could feel it, the precipice upon which they all stood. Then Catherine spoke, her voice carrying to every corner of the barn. "My husband murdered his father. I witnessed it. He pushed him from his horse, then watched him die slowly from his injuries. When I threatened to expose him, he began drugging my food, telling everyone I was ill. 3 weeks ago, he announced I had returned east. Instead, I was kept prisoner in the root cellar." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Samuel Murphy had been respected, even feared. His murder changed the equation significantly. Jackson, the foreman, suddenly produced a pistol. This has gone far enough. What happened next unfolded in heartbeats. Isaiah pushed Catherine toward the judge as Jackson raised his weapon. 2 shots rang out almost simultaneously. Jackson crumpled, a look of surprise on his face. Behind him stood Walter Pearson, the shopkeeper, a smoking derringer in his trembling hand. "He was going to shoot you," Walter said, looking stunned at his own actions. "I couldn't. My Emma was taken 3 years ago. Same way. Never saw her again." In the confusion that followed, Ethan Murphy attempted to flee. He made it as far as the barn door before being tackled by 2 local ranchers who had finally found their courage. "I've got a proposal," Isaiah announced, his deep voice cutting through the chaos. "A truth for a truth. Every man here knows something about Murphy's operations, who was bribed, who looked the other way, who profited. When the marshals arrive, they'll investigate everything, or—" He let the word hang in the air. "Or we ensure Ethan Murphy faces justice for his father's murder and his wife's imprisonment. And in return, the ledgers documenting other activities never surface." Sheriff Donovan, sensing which way the wind was blowing, quickly agreed. Murphy's crimes are his alone. No need to tarnish the whole territory with his sins. Judge Harrington gave Isaiah a long look, understanding the compromise being offered. "Justice takes many forms, Mr. Freeman. Are you certain this is sufficient?" Isaiah glanced at Catherine, who gave him an almost imperceptible nod. "It's a start," he said. "Sometimes that's all we can hope for." 3 months later, the summer sun beat down on the expanded boundaries of the Crescent Moon Ranch. New fencing marked land purchased from Ethan Murphy's estate after his hanging, prime acreage that doubled Isaiah's holdings. Catherine sat on the porch of the ranch house, her hair now healthy and shining in the sunlight, a journal open on her lap. She looked up as Isaiah approached on Thunder, returning from checking the southern pastures. "How are the new foals?" she called as he dismounted. "Strong. The Arabian bloodline is showing already." He removed his hat, wiping sweat from his brow. "Walter's coming for dinner tonight. Says he has news from town." Catherine smiled. The shopkeeper had become an unexpected ally, visiting regularly with supplies and information. "I'll make apple pie. He mentioned missing his mother's baking last time." Isaiah sat beside her on the porch, their shoulders nearly touching. They existed in a careful balance, employer and employee on paper, equal partners in practice. The arrangement raised eyebrows, but Judge Harrington's continued support kept overt hostility at bay. "I've been thinking," Catherine said, closing her journal, "about expanding further. The Wilson property adjoining our eastern boundary is available. The widow is returning to Pennsylvania." Isaiah nodded thoughtfully. "It's good land. Water access would help with the dry season." "We could build something extraordinary here, Isaiah." Catherine's voice grew passionate. "Not just a ranch, but a place where people could start over, regardless of their past or who they are." He studied her face, marveling at her resilience. In 3 months, she had transformed from a prisoner to a visionary, learning ranching with the same determination she applied to everything. "It won't be easy," he cautioned. "The territory's changing, but slowly." "Nothing worthwhile ever is easy," she replied. "My father taught me that before he died. He also taught me to recognize a good man when I saw one." Their eyes held for a long moment, an unspoken understanding passing between them. Whatever grew between them would develop in its own time, neither rushed nor denied. The sound of an approaching wagon broke the moment. Walter Pearson drove up, his usually serious face split by an unusual grin. "News," he called, even before the wagon stopped. "The territorial legislature passed it yesterday." "Passed what?" Isaiah asked, standing. Walter jumped down, waving a newspaper. "The bill recognizing property rights regardless of race or gender." Judge Harrington pushed it through. "Your case was cited specifically, unnamed, but everyone knows." Catherine took the paper, reading quickly. "This changes everything." "It's a start," Isaiah said, echoing his words from months earlier, but this time with a smile. Sometimes that's enough. As the sun set behind the mountains, casting golden light across the expanded Crescent Moon Ranch, 3 people sat on a porch sharing a meal and plans for a future that seemed, for the first time, limited only by their imagination rather than the color of Isaiah's skin or Catherine's gender. In the distance, a small herd of wild horses moved across the plain, free, unbroken, symbols of the frontier's true promise. And that's the incredible story of Isaiah Freeman, the black rancher who changed the Arizona territory forever with one brave bid at an auction. His story, like so many others of black heroes in the West, deserves to be remembered and celebrated. If you found this story powerful, please help me share it with others by hitting that like button and sharing this video. Your support helps ensure these forgotten histories reach the audience they deserve. And if you want to hear more untold stories from the Black Rancher channel, subscribe now and ring that bell for notifications. Each week, we uncover another chapter of history that was deliberately erased from our textbooks. Thank you for joining me on this journey through America's true past. Until next time, remember, courage knows no color, and freedom is worth fighting for, no matter the cost.